As creator, savior, as father of his people, God has some house rules for how we operate as his church, as his family. Those rules that we've been talking about are firmly rooted in God's nature, who he is, in his character, what he's like, in his design, how he's created things to be. Now, some of those house rules that we've been talking about are really hard for us to understand because our designs often differ from God's design. So it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it. But what we've been doing in 1 Timothy is looking at God's house rules. What does it mean to be his family on earth? How does he want his people to represent him, worship and serve him in this world together? Because his ways are good, his ways are right. And what does it look like then to do that as his people? We've been talking about all this because this year we've been talking about our walk with Jesus. So we want to talk about our church-wide walk with Jesus. Our walk with Jesus is not a solitary thing. It's something we do with his people. Our walks with Jesus is, the technical term for it is spiritual formation. Here's our definition that we've been communicating all year. A definition of spiritual formation is that it's a grace-filled relationship with Jesus in which he makes us more like himself for God's glory and for others' good. And so we've talked about engaging God's word, hearing from him. We've talked about praying to God, being assertive in our relationship. These are essential pieces of our walks with Jesus. And there's a lot more to it than that, but those are the two things we've focused on. But there's a third factor now this fall that we've started discussing, and that is our relationships with one another in the church. We follow Jesus together as the church. So as I'm preaching through 1 Timothy, these words are like primarily to people who consider themselves followers of Jesus, following him with others in a church family, in a church setting. If that's not you, if you're not, either you don't really consider yourself a follower of Jesus or don't know what that means, my hope is that you will see, read between the lines, and I'll try to make it clear at points. What does it mean to follow Jesus? What has he done for us at the cross? He's given himself for us for our forgiveness and for new life. And it's so important then to be part of a church family that we're following Jesus together with, to be in community, to surround ourselves with the encouragement as well as the accountability that's so desperately needed in all of our lives. So it's crucial. It's crucial to learn in our walk with Jesus how to walk together as a church. The Apostle Paul wrote a letter to a young pastor he was working with named Timothy. It's his first of two letters in the New Testament, 1 Timothy. And in this book, as I mentioned, Paul gives Timothy a set of instructions about living together as God's church. Paul summarized the purpose of this first letter in 1 Timothy 3:14 and 15. We've been reciting these verses in the hopes of memorizing them this fall. So read them along with me if you want. We'll put it up on the screen. Paul wrote, "Although I hope to come to you soon, I am writing you these instructions so that if I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth. The truth is nothing short of the gospel," and we'll talk about this next week. We're actually going to finally get to this passage next week. The truth is nothing short of the gospel of the crucified and risen King Jesus. That's what it is. It's the good news of what God is doing in the world through Jesus. And the church then is its pillar and foundation. That is, the church is the place where the church exists to enjoy, to protect, to display, and to spread the gospel to the nations. No other institution, no government, no business, no school, no ethnic group, no community, no nation, not even the family. As important as families are for existence, none of those communities have been given this task of enjoying, protecting, displaying, spreading the gospel on this planet. That is given to the church. It's because God gives the church that gospel mission, the church must follow his rules. He's its creator, savior, and king. He knows best. And so Timothy has been, Paul, after giving Timothy the gospel, reminding him of the gospel in chapter 1, of explaining to Timothy of its life-changing and life-giving effects, Paul then gives Timothy these house house rules for God's family. We've talked about some of them. He talks about what does it look like for God's church to worship and serve him in the world. It looks, first of all, like praying for all people. Just having a heart, God's heart, for all people. It looks like living respectful and godly lives wherever we're at. It looks like men praying, not with anger or with arguments, but with holiness and humility before God. It looks like women focusing on spiritual beauty, not physical beauty. It looks like women learning from Jesus, but not teaching or leading a church. And then last week we looked at how it looks like men, godly, qualified men, known for their Christ-like character, overseeing a church. It's one of the house rules. We talked about last week, if you were with us last week, we talked about, and if you weren't, let me highly recommend go back and keep reviewing this if you need to get caught up here, because this is all one letter written in one. You're supposed to just read this thing all the way straight through and understand what it means, but we're going slowly through it. Last week, we talked about how there's this idea of this office of overseer that Paul often uses interchangeably with another term, elder, that Paul also uses interchangeably sometimes with the word pastor. Well, here's a question that I want to just open with because it's going to it allows us to build on today's text, is what do elders do? Somebody asked me that this week. What is the elder's job description? Well, it's really broad. It's really broad. Biblically speaking, elders teach and lead the church like Jesus. I mean, that's it. There's several New Testament passages we could point to. I would point you, first of all, to 1 Peter 5, 1 through 5. You can look at, Peter spells out what it looks like for elders to teach and lead a church. He essentially says that like Jesus, the good shepherd, elders pour themselves out for the spiritual well-being of their church members. That's what they do. They teach the gospel and its implications wherever and whenever they can. And they pray and care for members on an individual basis as well. We're supposed to think of elders like shepherds. That's what they do. They care for God's flock. But elders cannot possibly meet every need for every member. Impossible. Which is why the scripture envisions another group who serves members in other ways. These men and women are called deacons. Deacons. Deacons, here's a definition. Deacons serve the church in other vital ways like Jesus. We'll talk about Acts chapter 6 in just a minute, but I want to talk about that word deacon. The word deacon comes from a Greek word, diakonos, and it's a broad term that means servant, minister. Usually the term is used to refer to somebody carrying out service or administering things on someone else's behalf, usually a superior. So interestingly, Paul calls himself a deacon. He's a deacon of Jesus Christ, sent by Jesus, and he's doing the ministry, the work of Jesus, the deacon work of Jesus in the world. Here in 1 Timothy, the word deacon is used as an official position of service in the church, working alongside the elders of the church, carrying out important ministry. The office of deacon, as it's used here, probably has its roots in Acts chapter 6. In Acts chapter 6, the early church, we studied Acts, the book of Acts last year. You may remember this story. The early church was growing like crazy. There were lots of widows in the church that needed to be cared for. One of the amazing privileges of a church family is to care for those in need, especially some of its most vulnerable, the widows. Well, Paul will actually spend time talking. He'll spend a whole chapter talking about widows in a few chapters. In chapter 5, Paul will have an extended discussion of widows in Timothy's church. All that to say, there were so many widows in this growing church, and the elders of the church, really the apostles at the time, couldn't possibly keep up. There were only 12 of them. They couldn't care for them. There are probably hundreds of widows at this point. If we're doing our math right and tracking the early church and throughout Acts, there's probably hundreds of widows. And they could not keep up with delivering or serving, deaconing the daily bread to each of these widows. They couldn't keep up with it. They wanted to. It was something they wanted to do, but they just couldn't do it. There were too many, and some were being neglected. Because they weren't known as well. Perhaps they were newer to the church and the apostles could not keep up with it. So the church chose 7 7 men to take on this ministry of deaconing, distributing, administering daily bread to widows in the church. They were there to help the overseers with this essential ministry of the church, caring for the needy. Because the overseers, elders, pastors, were focusing on shepherding, teaching, praying for members, caring for them spiritually in other ways. And ever since then, deacons have played this vital role in working alongside overseers or elders to serve the church in many ways. You'll actually get to meet some of our deacons and deaconesses at the end of the service, so you'll get to meet some of them. Like last week, I mentioned that Paul will tell Timothy in the church then, hey, here's what an elder looks like. We talked about this last week. Here's what an overseer, here's what their life should look like. These are the things to look for in an elder. In this next paragraph then, beginning in verse 8 in 1 Timothy 3, Paul will give qualities for deacons. This is what it looks like for a deacon. This is what their life should look like. And as we'll see again, just like last week, Paul's focus is a lot more, he's much more focused on character than on gifting. It's not so much a list of like, oh, they need to be good at leading and they need to be good at this and good at this. Paul's focus is much more on this is the kind of man they should be, or as we'll see today, also the kind of woman that they should be. His focus is character, Christ-like character. It's like Paul is training Timothy in the church to play I Spy with Christ-like qualities of servant leaders. My son loves I Spy books. I have here, Where's Waldo? Anybody like Where's Waldo? You know how to do Where's Waldo, right? You train your eyes to look for something. What are you looking for when you're looking for Waldo? What are you training your eyes to look for? Red and white. Red and white stripes. Now, every once in a while, they'll throw in somebody who looks a little bit like Waldo. Maybe he's got the red and white, but what's he lacking? He's lacking the glasses, right? Or maybe you'll see the glasses, but he's lacking the red and white. Paul is training and by the way, I've had to get really good at I Spy books. I spend a lot of time on this because in my household, some nights, nobody's allowed to go to bed until we can find, every last I Spy on that page. There's been some really brutal situations, like trying to find certain objects and certain pages, and we're completionists in the Sandison household. You just have to finish the page before you go to bed. So it can get pretty intense. All that to say, Paul is training Timothy, the church, to keep their eyes open. This is what an elder looks like. This is what a deacon looks like. This is what, as we'll see, what a deaconess looks like. To put it bluntly, what does it look like? Because they're going to be entrusted with tons of vital ministry in the church, the deacons and the deaconesses should meet a high standard of Christ-like character. That's it. Now, before we dive in, I think it's really important for me to add something. Some of the qualities that we'll be looking at, frankly, are something every single one of us, if you follow Jesus, you should aspire to some of these. All of these qualities. You should aspire to them. Every Christian should aspire to be growing and demonstrate these kinds of qualities. But here's the deal. In God's family, there is plenty of room for messed up people. We're all messed up. There's so much room for messed up people. And I think I want you to understand here that if you're reading this list and you're thinking, you're evaluating your own life, man, I'm so far from this. I just want you to know that Jesus, you're still invited into God's family. These are qualifications for deacons. It's a high standard to be entrusted with leadership in God's church, service and ministry like that. It's a high standard. We must not expect new Christians to immediately act like overseers and deacons. We should not expect that. And we must not accept overseers and deacons who act like babies in Christ, too. It's a high bar. That's the point. Everyone should aspire to these qualities, but deacons must actually meet them. Okay, must express them in their own lives. So let's get into it. We're in 1 Timothy 3, verse 8 is where we'll start. Paul will begin to give these He says, in the same way, deacons are to be, number one, worthy of respect. Deacons should be respectable. A Christian should be able to look at a deacon and say, he reminds me of Jesus, living this respectable life. It should be easy for a Christ follower to respect that person, to respect the Christian fruit, the spiritual fruit that's being born in their lives. Now, obviously, every Christian, as I just mentioned, should live a respectable life. In fact, in 1 Timothy 2, verse 2, we're to pray for all people and we're to what? Live godly and respectable lives in the world. It's something we should all aspire to. But here's Paul's point. A deacon must live a respectable life. Otherwise, you shouldn't make them a deacon. If a Christian, in other words, if a Christian doesn't live up to this high standard of respectability, it's not like they lose their salvation. It's not like they get kicked out of the church. Come on, let's keep growing. Let's keep following Jesus. Let's keep walking with him together, okay? But if a deacon, a current serving deacon, does not live respectably, they should no longer be a deacon. That's the point. The same would go for overseers. If there's an aspiring deacon who does not live a respectable life, they should not be made a deacon. That's the point. We're playing I Spy for people who would qualify to serve and represent Jesus in this way among his people. Worthy of respect. Number two, Paul says deacons are to be sincere. The word here literally means not double-tongued. They can't talk out of both sides of their mouth. The idea here is that a person may not say two different things. They have to say what they mean and do what they say. Be a person of their word. That's number two. Number three, not indulging in much wine. As with the overseer, quality that is mentioned along these lines, deacons should not demonstrate an excessive love for alcohol or really any sort of substance, any sort of addiction, which carries with it this idea of a disordered love for worldly things and these uncontrollable appetites, which can also have disastrous consequences when they play out in real life. Not indulging in much wine. Number four, and not pursuing dishonest gain. So similarly, like the elders who were not to be lovers of money, but instead lovers of people and even strangers, the deacons shouldn't be in this ministry for the money. They have to be honest. In fact, if you think about it, Judas Iscariot's sin was that he betrayed Jesus for money. And even before that fateful night where he literally in the moment betrayed Jesus for money, he had already been betraying Jesus and the poor and his fellow disciples for money because he was helping himself to the disciples' bank account. Must not be pursuing dishonest gain. Number five, another quality to be looking for in deacons is gospel roots and fruit. Gospel roots and fruit. This comes from verse 9. Let me read that. Gospel roots and fruit. They, deacons, must keep hold of the deep truths of the faith with a clear conscience. Now, one of the main differences in Paul's list of qualifications between an overseer and a deacon is that overseers were to be able to teach. Remember, teaching is going to be a big part of the overseer role. It's a big part of what it means to be a shepherd, is to be able to teach. Deacons will not need to be able to teach, but they will need to have the roots down deep in the gospel. So much so that they won't be able to be swayed by false teaching, which is rampant in the church that Timothy is pastoring at this moment, and rampant in our churches today. Deacons should have these deep, solid understandings of the gospel, and it should be working itself out in a clear conscience. This life, again, that is producing gospel fruit, a life that's been changed by the gospel. So gospel, deep roots in their soul, producing itself in their attitudes and behaviors, qualities that look just like Jesus. Gospel, roots, and fruit. Number 6, a deacon should be above reproach. In verse 10, Paul writes, they must first be tested And then if there is nothing against them, let them serve as deacons. This quality is very similar to the qualifications regarding overseers in those 3 proving grounds we talked about. Remember those 3 tests that elders had from last week? First, the family, and then time, the test of time and just following Jesus for a long time, faithfully. The 3rd proving ground was their witness in the community. How do outsiders think of them? Do they have a good witness in the community? Now, if a deacon is found to be above reproach, presumably in areas of life like this, and they have this good witness, they've been tested, they've been proven, Paul says, let them serve. They've passed this test. In fact, that's what happens when we as a church are voting to affirm elders and deacons. We're saying we believe that these men and women have passed the test. And they can serve in these official capacities. That's what we're communicating when we vote. We'll be voting actually on next year's 2023's elders, deacons, deaconesses in just about a month. The elders will be recommending those in a couple weeks, and then we'll vote a couple weeks later. But that's what we're saying. We may not know each one of those candidates. We may not know each one of those individuals well or personally, or perfectly, certainly. But we can see, either by their commendation from others, from the elders, from other members of the church, we can see that there is a sense in which they are passing the test. All right, so Paul will come back to the 7th quality here shortly for deacons, but he goes on what seems like a bit of a rabbit trail. In verse 11, Paul says, it's not a rabbit trail, but it might seem like that at first. We'll come back and talk about it in a second. He says in verse 11, in the same way, the women are to be, and we'll come back to it in just a second. Now, this is very interesting because Paul is talking about deacons in verses 8 through 10. He's going to come back and talk about deacons in verse 12. But here in verse 11, he stops and he talks about, he's going to give 4 qualifications for women. Now, what's this about? What women? He's been talking about deacons. Well, some think Paul is talking about the wives of deacons. All right, so perhaps Paul is taking a break to talk about, well, the wives of deacons need to meet these certain qualifications, just as a deacon would, maybe the wives do as well. We do not think that is the case. And here's why. It would be very odd for Paul to suddenly go on this rabbit trail about deacons' wives when there were no qualifications for overseers' wives. If you go back and you read verses 1 through 7, he says that an overseer must be a husband to one wife, faithful to one wife in the NIV. He does talk about the wife, but there's no qualification other than that an overseer must just be married to one. Plus, grammatically, from the context here, there's no indication that these women belong to or are married to the deacons. It's a standalone verse suddenly about women. What's going on? Well, we understand this to refer not to the wives of deacons, but to female deacons, women who are serving as deacons. We call them deaconesses. That's the term we have. Now, we actually have an example of a female deacon in the Bible in Romans 16:1. Paul names her. Her name was Phoebe. Phoebe was a deacon in a church in a city near the city of Corinth. There's 2 letters in the New Testament written to Corinth, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Phoebe was from a church near the Corinthian church. And she is probably, the reason Paul mentions her in Romans 16 is she's probably part of this group that brought Paul's letter to the church in Rome. He commends Phoebe, a deacon in this church, to the Roman churches. He wants them to respect her and to take care of her and to do well by her, probably as his representative helping to deliver this letter. We also have examples of female deacons early in church history. I'll just give you one amazing example. In the year 112, so this is about 50 years after Paul wrote 1 Timothy to Timothy, okay? So 112, 50 years later, in the same region of the world where Timothy would have been pastoring, there was a Roman governor who, in one of his official communications, wrote about the fact that he had arrested 2 deaconesses from a local church near Ephesus. He had arrested these 2 deaconesses, and in his official communication says that he proceeded to torture them in order to persecute, oppress the faith, to learn more about it so that you might undermine it. Now, we don't know anything about, other than that communication, we don't know anything about these two deaconesses, other than he knew them as deaconesses, and they were amazing women. To be arrested and tortured by a Roman official and remain faithful, he said he couldn't break them. What an amazing story. If you're a deaconess in our church, you've got to come from this rich tradition of epic women. So we understand this text to refer to deaconesses. Now, I think that Paul goes on this rabbit trail, which is really not a rabbit trail, because he wants to make sure that women are explicitly included among the deacons. And he wants to specifically address the qualities that Timothy and his church should be looking for in female deacons. Because remember, in chapter 2, Paul had instructed Timothy that based on God's good design for men and women should not teach or lead a whole church. Paul had taught that to Timothy. Teaching and leading a whole church, that's the role of an overseer. However, that instruction, and Paul, I think, is trying to make this clear, that instruction does not exclude women from serving in a deacon role, which is why he wants to be sure to touch on women serving as deacons. He doesn't want any of his readers, Timothy's church, us, to misunderstand what he's saying about women. It is very possible for someone to just read like a couple sentences in chapter 2 of 1 Timothy and walk away with the impression that the only thing women should do is have babies. We talked about that a few weeks ago, and if you weren't here for that, I would highly recommend you go back and listen to the whole thing and read the whole thing in context. Because that is not what Paul was saying. There are all sorts of good works that a woman should do, all sorts of good works. And childbearing is a big one. That's one that only they can do. That was in chapter 2, verse 15. But it's not the only good work. Worshiping God, chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Learning from Jesus, chapter 2, verse 11, were two other works he mentioned. And I think Paul is explicitly including women here as deacons because he wants them to see that this is another form of good work that they can be about. So here's the qualifications Paul gives. Here's how to spot a deaconess. Number one, and this will sound familiar, worthy of respect. Worthy of respect. Just like overseers, just like deacons, a deaconess should live a respectable life. A Christian should be able to look at her and say, wow, she reminds me of Jesus. Number two, a deaconess should not be a malicious talker. Paul tells Timothy that deaconesses should be using their words wisely, honestly. The literal phrase here is that deaconesses should not be diabolical or devilish. That's what it means, diabolical or devilish. Now, it could be translated also as slanderous, and slander, of course, is one of the quickest ways to destroy God's household, his family, and deaconesses should stay far away from it. Number three, he says that the women are to be temperate. The word here means self-controlled, sober. This probably includes a reference to alcohol abuse, which has been a theme. But it's probably bigger than that too. It's probably this idea that they should follow Jesus throughout the course of their life with clear minds, in a clear-minded way. Number four, the fourth qualification is they should be trustworthy in everything. Now, obviously, if a deaconess is to be entrusted with vital ministry, she must be reliable and faithful in everything, in the tasks and the commitment and all that. But again, it's probably it's even more than that, right? It's faithful to Christ, first and foremost. That's who she's serving. She is serving the church on behalf of Jesus. So faithful to him and to his ways, and also, of course, faithful to her work and to the church. Well, after touching on these qualifications, Paul then circles back to a seventh trait for deacons, which probably also applies to deaconesses as well, in principle. And that seventh trait is this: a good husband and father. Verse 12, a deacon must be faithful to his wife and must manage his children and his household well. So just as we learned last week, good husbands and good dads make good overseers. Same applies. Good husbands and good dads make good deacons. And also, you could also say, good wives and good mothers make good deaconesses. I want to make a correction, actually, from something I said last week. I talked about, last week when I was on a similar qualification for overseers, I talked about, well, how does an aspiring overseer who has no children, how can they still be tested? How can they still prove their respectability? How can they prove their fruitfulness? And I used a phrase, I think I misused it, cut their teeth. I don't know if you remember me saying that. I think I misapplied that phrase. I said a lot of times aspiring overseers or pastors will cut their teeth in kids and student ministry. And I'm afraid that might have been taken, that I might have been miscommunicated what's going on there. By cutting their teeth, I did not mean that aspiring overseers should use precious and impressionable kids and teens as guinea pigs and screw them up. to see if they should be an overseer or a pastor. That's not what I meant. I meant that a single or childless overseer, aspiring overseer, can be tested. It's a great testing ground, as any kids or youth leader does, as anyone who works in kids or youth ministry. They can be tested in how they minister to the church family or to the children of the members under the oversight of elders. That's really important. So under the oversight of pastors, elders, people who have been tested and appointed and put in those kinds of positions. And those kind of testing grounds could include for a single or a childless overseer, could include involvement in small group ministries, hospitality ministry, evangelism ministries, all sorts of other kind of ministries that you could be involved in. Do you carry yourself in the family of God? If you don't have your own family, do you carry yourself with respectability? Are you passing that test? That's the question. And I think the same applies for aspiring deacons and deaconesses. Maybe not married, maybe don't have kids. You can still prove yourself in respectability and fruitfulness in ministry within the family of God. Paul closes this section on some of these house rules in verse 13 with this. He says this about the deacons and the deaconesses. Those who have served well gain an excellent standing and great assurance in their faith in Christ Jesus. Here's Paul's point. There is glory in serving. There is glory in pouring yourself out for the crucified and risen King Jesus and for his people. See, in the world's eyes, it's not glorious. Not glorious. As a deacon or deaconess, you're often doing stuff behind the scenes, or you're doing stuff for people who they don't have anything to offer you in return. But deacons and deaconesses don't serve for that kind of glory or reward anyways. Deacons and deaconesses serve for the life-changing, life-giving power of the cross-shaped life. They do it to unleash the mighty love of Jesus Christ in tangible ways among the people of God and in the community at large. They do it because deacons and deaconesses serve because God deserves and sees and honors their sacrifice, their service. Did you know that Jesus, in fact, once called himself a deacon? Here's the story. At the Last Supper, this is in Luke 22, verse 24. At the Last Supper, Jesus has established the Lord's Supper, which we'll eat in just a minute. Remember where he gives them the body and says, eat this and remember me, my body broken for you. And then he gives him the cup and he says, drink this, remember me, my blood poured out for you. Right after Jesus gives them the Lord's Supper, here's what happens. A fight broke out. Luke 22:24. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be greatest. And Jesus said to them, here they are, right? They just eaten the first communion ever, and they're like, who's the greatest? How petty can you be, right? And yet those impulses are right here too. Who's the greatest? Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like one who serves or deacons. For who is greater? The one who is at the table, literally who reclines at the table. In first century Israel, they didn't have chairs. They had pillows that they'd lay back on and recline at when they ate. And Jesus says, who's greater? The one who is at the table, or literally reclining, or the one who serves, literally deaconing? Is it not the one who is at the table? Because in Jesus' day and age, it's the person who's sitting back, right? Who's like, I'm the boss. I'm the man. We're eating dinner last night at the table. We're around the dinner table. And I made the dinner for the most part, by the way. I made it myself, and it was pretty good. Yeah? All three of them said it was good. So there you go. I did it. And then we kind of got done eating. I'm full. It was chicken. It was a whole chicken I made in the oven. It was a tiny turkey, according to my children. And we're eating it, and I finish, and what do? I kind of sit back in my chair. I'm reclining, right? And I'm just waiting. I'm waiting for everybody else to clean up, right? So I'm the man. I'm the head of the household. I'm the husband. I'm the dad. So I'm going to... And now, of course, I see Emily is working to try and get everything cleaned up. And she's like, hint, hint, help clean up. So I get out of my chair and I go and help, because that's what men do and heads of household do. And that's what dads do. And that's what husbands do. That's what Jesus does. Here's what Jesus says. Who's greater, the one in reclining or the one serving, the one deaconing? He says, is it not the one who is at the table? But here's Jesus' zinger in verse 27. He says, but I am among you as one who serves. I am among you as one who deacons. Did you catch that? Jesus calls himself a deacon. He says, who's greater? I know in this world it's the one who gets to sit back. But here's King Jesus serving the food. He served the bread and passed the cup. That was him. And he cleaned up after. He's bussing tables. The King of Kings. That's what it looks like. Here's Jesus' point. In our broken and sinful world, glory goes to the one who sits back and gets served. But in the cross-shaped kingdom of heaven, the king is the one who serves far more than anyone else. All the way to the cross, paying a debt we could never pay apart from eternal torment. Right there, suffering and dying in our place for our forgiveness of our sins. The place of service is the glorious place. Remember, that's why God raised Jesus from the dead and exalted him as King of Kings, not just because he was Jesus, but because he was Jesus who served and gave himself up for us. If deaconing or serving in general isn't beneath Jesus, then deaconing and serving in general isn't beneath his people either, his followers. It's what we do. Now, our deacons and deaconesses rarely get the recognition they deserve. Rarely. But we should thank God for them, and we should be praying for them. They're in it. They're into serving the church, and they do it with amazing hearts and attitudes. They serve in vital ways. To bless us, to honor God. They're not there for the recognition, but I do want to just point them out for just a second, okay? First, we have 4 different teams. As of right now, we have 4 different teams that we call deacon teams, and deacons and deaconesses serve on these teams, and they serve the church in incredibly important areas of ministry that the elders shouldn't be focusing on. One is facilities, taking care of this building. Mark Lynn is our deacon, currently serving on that team. Mark's looking for a few more good men and ladies to serve on that team and help in that way, but we're very, very grateful for Mark for serving in that capacity. He's right down here. We have a finance team who oversees financials, all that kind of stuff, so that the elders don't have to spend a lot of time on that. That's our deaconesses who serve on that team are Alicia Kemi, Kim Knoll, and Becky Lynn. I believe there's one more showing interest right now. We might be able to add one more to the team in the year ahead. We have a missions team, our third team. Their job is to pray for, they show hospitality to our wonderful missional partners who need support abroad, who need to be welcomed in and received warmly when they visit Calvary on occasion. We'll have some missionaries here, retiring missionaries here next week. The deacons and deaconesses who serve on that team, Bob Davies, Diane Davies, Linda Heimforth, Becky Postma, Marilyn Scraver. And then we have a congregational care team. They help out in a multitude of ways, caring for people in the church family. Russ Albright, Kim Knoll, those individuals work specifically with our benevolent fund. We're so grateful for you two. And Chris and Ruth Rose, who work, do some ministry in the kitchen, make sure there's coffee each week with some others, and are also out serving our housebound members scattered throughout the community who can't make it here on a regular basis. Can you guys say thank you to these brothers and sisters who serve? They come to church, and as much as I hope that they're worshiping and learning and enjoying God with us, they're also coming in, they're pouring themselves out. They're giving of themselves on a regular basis in these official positions. Now, we have a couple others I want to just mention by name, not technically labeled deacons or deaconesses, but serve in really important ways. They're actually appointed by elders, but they don't technically have that title. And Melissa Medendorp serves as our treasurer. She's so amazing. And Peter Stinson as our head teller. He's the one that oversees a team of highly, like just wonderful, high-integrity people who count our offerings each week. Wow, that's a huge responsibility. So we're grateful to Melissa and to Peter for serving in those ministries as well.